Dr. Peter Edbury is Professor Emeritus of Medieval History at Cardiff University and has published widely on the history institutions of the kingdoms founded by the Crusaders in the Near East, including books, The Kingdom of Cyprus and the Crusades, Kingdoms of the Crusades from Jerusalem to Cyprus, and John of Ibelin, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, to name but a few. Today, Dr. Edbury is here to discuss a very, very interesting topic in Cypriot history, and that, of course, is the Templars in Cyprus. Peter, welcome, and thank you for accepting my invitation.
Well, thank you. I've been looking forward to our chat.
You know, I want to start off by just talking about Templars in pop culture. Certainly, there's no shortage of them. And if you think of Dan Brown's books, Indiana Jones, even video games, what do you think is its enduring appeal in the popular imagination?
Well, because the whole point about pop culture is that it feeds off itself. The Templars were a bit exotic. They were always controversial, even in the years when they were in existence. They're sort of regarded as supermen warriors. They're quite an unsavory reputation. And of course, at the end, they were violently suppressed. And they were associated with heresy and witchcraft and the occult. It's a heavy mixture, and it's the sort of thing that appeals to conspiracy theorists and people who want to believe that everything is connected to everything else. So in their case, Templars are connected to the Cathars, to the heretics of southern France. They're connected to the assassins, the Ismaili Islamic group who gave their name to the language. Completely untrue, actually, but the popular, once it's in the popular imagination, you can't dislodge it. It stays put.
Let's take a step back then and then try to wrap our heads around what the Templar Order is. In other words, its origins, its precepts, and its mandate.
Okay, well, very briefly, they got started in the 1120s, and the simple idea to start with was that they would be a group of knights who were going to provide an armed escort for pilgrims coming to Jerusalem from the port of Jaffa, present-day Tel Aviv. The road was dangerous, they needed an armed escort, and these people saw this as a work of charity, offering them this protection. So it's a work of charity which necessarily required armed men. And they were very successful. And the grateful beneficiaries in the West gave generously an appreciation of the service they performed. So in a very short time, within really sort of 20 years of their founding, they'd become very wealthy. And they were able to recruit widely in the West, and they were able to take on much greater responsibilities among the Crusaders for defense, defending the lands conquered by the Crusaders at the very beginning of the 12th century. And so they acquired castles and other military responsibilities. And more importantly, they were also came to be seen as the elite in the field army. They were the crack troops. So much so that famously after the Battle of Hattin, which the Crusaders lost spectacularly, the Sultan Salah ad-Din had them all put to death. He didn't keep them as prisoners of war. That was the origin back in the 12th century.
And Templars, they would principally come from France and elsewhere across Europe, or
Yes.
did we have Templar presence in Jerusalem as well, like an established group?
This is rather curious. To start with, they recruited among in the West, but also among the settler communities in the Holy Land and the other areas conquered by the Crusaders. At some point in the 13th century, they stopped doing this. And it's all rather obscure because there's no sort of regulation which says you've got to stop doing this. They stopped recruiting in the East. So much so that when at the beginning of the 14th century, the order was suppressed, every time a member of the Templar Order was brought up before the Inquisitor, the first question would be, where did you come from originally? And not a single one claimed to have originated actually in the East. They were all from France, Spain, a few from England, some from Italy, some from Germany, but none at all from the Holy Land and none at all from Cyprus.
Now, with regards to Cyprus, now that you mentioned Cyprus, what sources have historians come to rely on given the paucity of textual evidence?
Well, the sources for Cypriot history in the 13th century in particular are very bitty. There are narrative sources, there are chronicles that people wrote. There are a limited amount of documentary material, but the Templars themselves have left no documents at all. So we rely on sort of chance mentions in other people's archives. Papal letters are quite helpful. There's a lot of letters addressed to people in Cyprus, and so on. So there's no sort of big, obvious source to start you off. It's a question of sort of gathering odds and ends from all over the place. The narrative sources, the famous source from the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century is William of Tyre. He ends in 1184, so it's before we get started in Cyprus. But there are various continuations of William of Tyre which offer help. The trouble with them is that they're not as contemporary as we would like. So, for example, the accounts of the conquest of Cyprus and the Templar acquisition of Cyprus in 1191 are all written up about 30 or 40 years after the events. When we come to the other end, to the suppression of the order at the beginning of the 14th century, there we rely on a translation, 16th century translation of an old French text that's more or less contemporary. In other words, what we're looking at is a translation which we hope, we assume, is a faithful translation, but of course there's no way of knowing. And that is a major source for the suppression of the order in Cyprus. And we'll talk about that later, I expect.
So Richard Lionheart conquers Cyprus in 1191. With what objective? I mean, is it your opinion that it was incidental or was this planned?
Well, there's quite a lot of discussion about this. My instinct, I've always sort of very much inclined to the incidental, that it's a chapter of accidents rather than it was something that was premeditated. But this is controversial. Of course, Richard isn't going to say that. What you get is a sort of black legend. What happened was that Cyprus had been taken over by a usurper, a renegade member of the Byzantine imperial family who'd cut loose from Constantinople. And of course, the Western sources all sort of try and blacken this man's memory. This gets a very bad press, actually. The Byzantines didn't like him because he rebelled, and the Western sources wanted to make out that he was a complete blackguard so they could justify the conquest. And it means you get a sort of very sort of lopsided view of what's actually going on. Richard's conquest seems to have been effected very quickly and easily, which I suspect is more a reflection on the unpreparedness of the forces at the disposal of the Greek ruler, Isaac Comnenus.
And he would sell Cyprus ultimately to the Templars.
Yes, quite quickly he hit on the idea of making over the whole island to the Templars in return for money, sold it in effect. And he wanted 100,000 bezants, gold coins, 100,000 gold bezants.
Yeah.
Which the Templars paid 40,000, not because simply because it was a question of not actually being able to put their hands on the ready cash there and then. Richard needed money. He could see that if his campaign was going to succeed against the Muslims, he needed to be able to spend money and spend it lavishly. And so he sort of tried to grab everything he could. He on the way to the Holy Land, he grabbed his sister's dower and other things. He raised a huge amount of money back home in the West.
And why were the Templars interested then in purchasing Cyprus? I mean, I understand that for Richard, this is going to fund the Third Crusade. For the Templars, what's in it for them?
Well, it's very difficult to know. I mean, I think they could see they were getting a bargain. After all, it's not such a huge amount of money, really, for what is actually a very fertile and prosperous place. They were ambitious. The other thing, we have to keep in mind is that although they'd never actually ruled an island in northern Syria, in what is now southern Turkey, around north of Antakya, Antioch. They had large lordship, frontier lordship, so they were quite used to controlling sort of huge areas of land, which they would rule from their fortresses. So in Syria, there's a major fortress at Bagras, north of Antioch, the present-day Antakya in southern Turkey. This is the area that was devastated in the earthquake the other year. And there are other ones, a place called Safita in Syria, not too far from Tripoli. So they were experienced with large tracts of land that they were defending. But of course, the point about Cyprus is because it was an island, it wasn't so under threat. And so what they were probably seeing was a place which would be a resource, financial resource, that they could get the produce, they could get the revenues without actually having to spend too much on defending it. I think this is probably the appeal. Clearly, what you have is a predominantly agrarian society. So it's a question of what you can get from the local peasantry. Cyprus is, again, it's on the trade route. Any trader trading from Western Europe to Syria is going to call in at Cyprus, even if briefly, simply to take on fresh water and supplies. So there's commercial wealth as well, but I think the primary interest is going to be in the agrarian wealth. It's quite interesting that once the situation settles down and the Templars have given up trying to rule Cyprus and they're given estates in the island, quite a number of them are in the sort of prime wine growing area on the southern slopes of the Troodos.
Now, Easter of 1192, we learned that the Cypriots rose in revolt. I suppose I have two questions here. The first question is, do we know if the revolt was across class lines? And in other words, were both peasants and nobles involved? And of course, what were the origins of the revolt? Like, what grievances propelled this to happen?
Well, what seems to happen, it does seem to have been a popular outbreak of the sort of local citizenry in Nicosia itself and the surrounding areas. These are people, of course, who had suffered invasion. I mean, it's only, it's not very long since Richard and his people had actually invaded the island. Resentment against the invaders, plus, of course, the fact that they were aware that the Templars themselves were numerically rather thin on the ground. So it's a sort of natural reaction to an intrusive alien force that have taken control. So I think this is probably what's happening. The Templars, of course, were trying to raise the money to pay off their debt. And that obviously is going to make them unpopular with the people, especially the people who've got a bit rather more money that the Templars would try and take away from them. So it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on. The trouble is that the sources for all this are rather problematic. The story that is usually told is that the Templars holed up in the fortress in Nicosia itself. They sallied forth and slaughtered a huge number of the local population with major massacre. The problem is that the only really contemporary source, which is somebody writing across in northern Syria at the time, reports that the insurgents wanted to kill the Templars. The Templars did battle and won. They say nothing of any major massacre. The stories, the sort of atrocity stories that follow, which are really only in sources which are being put together 40 years later, and you just wonder whether they've grown in the telling. The other point about the later narratives are that in some cases the Templars come out of it very badly. There's a sort of sense among the writers, and of course these are Latin writers, these are sympathetic to the Templars, which they should be, saying basically the Templars should never have got themselves into this mess, and the way they behaved was actually quite unnecessary. So there are sort of all sorts of problems with understanding what went on. Simply take the narratives at face value is a bit difficult.
Given the their low numbers, how were they so successful? How were they able to put down this revolt?
If we believe the narratives, it's just a question of a surprise attack. They suddenly sort of opened the gates of the castle and charged out. I don't know whether, we can't really say any more about that, because I mean, that's more or less basically what we're stuck with. It may well be that the insurgents, or people who were themselves largely unarmed, or if they were armed, sort of inadequately armed.
Now, you would think that after the revolt was put down so heavy-handedly, you would think that, all right, well, things will continue the way they were, but Cyprus is then sold. And I want to try to better understand, why did they feel this need to rid themselves of Cyprus if ostensibly the problem was solved?
Well, that's a good question. And the short answer is I just don't know. Yes, they seem to have given up rather easily. And indeed, this is one of the criticisms that was levelled at them by writers of the next generation. Why did they give up so soon? The whole thing is very odd. There's a lot of things rather odd about this. One of the things that isn't generally realised is that the master of the temple, the head of the order at that time, was very much Richard's protege, a man called Robert of Sablé, who was actually one of Richard's vassals, who had only joined the order shortly before he was actually elected master, no doubt with Richard's connivance. So there's all sorts of unknown quantities going, all sorts of odd things happening. Robert of Sablé, come back to your original question about the popular culture. He is the man who features very much in the computer game, The Assassin's Creed.
Right.
Not a game I'm familiar with, of course, you understand.
Yeah, it is something, admittedly, I have dabbled in myself,
Yes.
which is one of the reasons why I've been kind of sucked into the whole Templar narrative.
Yes.
They actually made, I don't know if you're aware of this, obviously the antagonists in the entire franchise are the Templars, but they actually made one game entirely set on Cyprus. I don't know if you know this.
I didn't know that. What happened was that quite a long time ago, I was persuaded to do podcasts on Robert of Sablé for Dan Snow's. Dan Snow's done a series of podcasts.
Yes.
On this. You should probably seen that series. Yes. Well, I'm actually in that.
Oh, wow.
And he's got various people to talk about the sort of real history behind the Assassin's Creed. As I say, I've been retired now for quite a long time. I'm told by a friend of mine who actually teaches modules on the Crusade history in one of the universities in London that that's a big bugbear of his life, that he's got all these students who know all about the Assassin's Creed, know far more about the Assassin's Creed computer games than they know about real history.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now, I was under the impression that the Templars, when they rid themselves of Cyprus, it was done so in its entirety. But I was surprised in preparing for this episode to learn that they actually held many estates afterwards. Do we know which modern towns or villages were historically Templar estates?
We got some idea. There were a number of the most important place they had was a fortress on the coast north of Salamis at a place called Gastria. There isn't very much left. I don't think it could have been a major, it certainly wasn't a major fortress, but that actually was the one fortified point on the island that they had. There were other places, as I say, many of them, no major town, but a number of villages, especially in the hills just to the north of Limassol.
Did they maintain a military presence on the island as well?
Well, not as far as we can make out, probably not. But in other words, once the Lusignan regime was established, and we assume, we don't know, but we assume they acquired most of their estates early on. All they would have maintained in the island were simply a few people to actually administer the estates. Typically what would happen with the Templar Order would be that they would recruit comparatively young warriors who would go off and be prepared to fight and if necessarily die in the defense of the Holy Land. And then later on, those that actually survived the rigor of the military campaigns would be sort of pensioned off by sending them back to Western Europe, or in this case to Cyprus, to administer the estates. And so you have these sort of sort of rather more senior figures who have now been stood down from active service, turning themselves into a sort of celibate local country squire, really, I suppose. So that they would administer the estates. And all the information we have seems to suggest that quite a lot of the income from the estates got spent on administration. In other words, these people who did the estate administration did themselves rather well.
Mm-hmm. In 1291, Acre fell, and we learn that the Templars moved their headquarters to Cyprus. And this period is a time where there's exacerbated tensions between the Lusignans and the Templars. Now, was this the root of the conflict, or was there something brewing beforehand? I know
yes, we have to go back. For a long time, the impression we get is that relations between the Templars and the authorities in Cyprus are very good. So much so that in 1253, when King Henry I of Cyprus died, he was actually buried in the Templar church in Nicosia. Now, sadly, we've no idea where that was. So, in other words, for the monarch to choose that as his place of burial is actually quite striking. What eventually happened was that for all sorts of complicated dynastic reasons, the kings of Cyprus acquired the title to the throne of Jerusalem, and it was disputed. And their rival for the title of King of Jerusalem was the then ruler of southern Italy, Charles of Anjou. And again, the story is quite complex, but in 1277, Charles managed to get control of the one major Crusade city on the mainland of what is now Israel, the town of Acre, the present-day Akko in northern Israel. And the king of Cyprus at the time, Hugh III, responded predictably because the Templars had helped Charles's officers take control. Hugh III responded by sequestrating their estates, and it was smoothed over eventually, but it left a sort of lasting legacy of ill feeling. So that was the sort of background. So that's the 1270s. Fast forward to 1291, whilst the survivors of the Templars who survived the siege of Acre regroup in Cyprus, and Cyprus has now become, so to speak, the frontline state in the conflict with the Muslim world. These Templars in Cyprus, are the members of the order who are on active service. So in other words, instead of just having a few Templars in the past who had been estate administrators, you've actually now got a significant force of warrior knights who, of course, are reinforced from the west. Now, the big difference is that when they'd been in what is now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, they'd actually controlled major fortresses. There was the castle of Athlete on the coast of what is now Israel, between Haifa and Caesarea, which you can see from the main road if you're in Israel. There was the town of Sidon, which is in Lebanon, and then further north on the coast of what is now Syria, the town of Tartus. And these were places which were all lost in 1291. And these were places which they had virtually sovereign rights over. So the rulers, the king of Jerusalem, couldn't really intervene in how they did things there. They've lost all that. Now they're in Cyprus, and they've got nothing similar. They're very much, they don't have their own enclave. They don't have their own lordship. They are, they have their headquarters building in Limassol. They have various estates, but they've got no big castle. no independent enclave. And I think they actually took quite a lot of effort to actually adjust to this new state of affairs, and they felt uncomfortable with it. They were worse off.
Yeah.
The King of Cyprus, on the other hand, could realise very quickly that he needed to keep a tight grip on things, otherwise, his own position would be undermined.
It's not too long after 1291 where the Templars are ordered to be arrested. I think it was King Philip IV
Yes.
who orders the arrest of the Templars in France, followed by Pope Clement's papal bull.
Yes.
So why were these orders issued? What did they accuse? You hinted at this at the start of the interview. What did they accuse the Templars of?
Well, as I say, the Templars in Cyprus are the members of the order who are on active service. So, of course, they're much more of a threat to the authority, and they're much better able to defend themselves in theory. What's happened is something rather complicated to do with the politics. Just before the Templars were arrested in France, back in 1306, there'd been a coup d'etat in Cyprus. The king, Henry II, was generally regarded as being completely useless. And his younger brother, who was also the heir presumptive to the throne, seized power with the support of a large proportion of the nobility and, among others, the Templars. This is what called Amaury of Tyre. So Amaury of Tyre basically seizes power. The king is just told to go away to his estate and fly his falcons and not take any further part in government. And Amaury is now going to rule. So the Templars are Amaury's friends. So really, what's now happened in 1306 is really the first time since the 1270s that the Templars are actually actively supportive of the government.
Right.
That was 1306. 1307, the Templars are arrested in Cyprus. It's not until June 1308 that the papal order to arrest the Templars reaches Cyprus. So in other words, there's quite a long delay between the arrest in France and the arrest in Cyprus. And what happens is, again, slightly curious in that although the Templars are there and they realise they're under threat, they seem to have allowed themselves to be arrested without too much of a fight, any fight really. It sounds as if Amaury had said, in effect, look, we've got to play along with the Pope. Don't kick up a fuss. We'll keep you under sort of very light touch house arrest. You can all go and live on various of your estates. Don't rock the boat and I'll see you all right. Simply because it didn't happen that way. So the Templars are arrested, even though Amaury regards them as his friends. Yeah, but one thing, he's got to make up his mind. Which way is he going to jump? By 1308, Amaury's power base in Cyprus is slipping away. He's not quite as popular as he was in 1306. And there's a new crusade in the offing. And the danger is that when the Crusaders arrive, they will side with his rival, the rulers of southern Italy, the rival to the crown of Jerusalem, and also they've got a pretender to the throne of Cyprus as well in train. So I think Amaury feels vulnerable to the crusade. He doesn't want to antagonize the Pope or the Church. And so rather than do that, he turns on his friends, his allies. He doesn't, what do you do? Of course, the intriguing question is, if he hadn't jumped that way, if he jumped the other way, would the order actually have ever been suppressed? Because he was a sort of major element in the order surviving outside the immediate reach of the papacy.
They had substantial numbers in Cyprus. You would think that they could have been well prepared to defend themselves. So are you suggesting that they sort of let their guard down during this time because Amaury said, hey, listen, just
Yes.
sit back, everything's all right?
Well, it looks as if they were sort of strung along. What happens, of course, is the whole thing gets upset. The papacy initiates a sort of trial procedure. The Templars are charged with heresy, with various occult practices, and in 1310 they actually open a trial procedure presided over by one of the bishops, and the Templars will deny everything, as they would, almost certainly, because most of the charges are untrue anyway. But what is much more interesting is that so do the non-Templar witnesses. The witnesses all say, well, we've never heard of these accusations. We don't believe there's any truth in them. As far as we know, that they're all good Christians who believe all the Orthodox Christian beliefs and so on. And there's really no sort of traction for the trial procedures. At that point, Amori is assassinated, and the trial stops abruptly because of the sort of kerfuffle in Nicosia with this political assassination. And what happens is that the king, who's generally regarded as totally useless, is then brought back into power, and that takes several months to effect. And so go into 1311 and you get a second bite at the cherry, new trial procedures. And this time, the lay witnesses include quite a number of people who had always been supportive of the king and who were therefore more likely to be hostile to the Templars because the Templars had supported his brother Amori back in 1306. And they all say the same thing. We don't think there's anything, the charges don't seem groundless. We don't know anything about it. The first time we ever heard these accusations was when the letters came from the papacy with the charges. Before that, there'd never been any inkling there was anything wrong. All right, yes, they were our political opponents. We argued with them. They could be very awkward in political terms, but no, they're not heretics. They're not engaged in occult practices, or anything else like that.
Mari, why was he? Do we know the motivations around his assassination? Do we know who assassinated him?
Well, the principal source simply suggests it was some personal grudge on the part of a member of his own household. One of the problems is this, and it's the same with a lot. It's the same source that tells us about the Templars. It's this 16th century translation. It's a very detailed narrative. It's very informative. And it's like that sort of line that you get over and over again in these police procedural dramas we get on the television. Sooner or later, somebody is going to say, yes, I think he's telling the truth, but he's not telling the whole truth. In other words, our author is holding out on us. And I think the motivation for the murder of Amori is something which leaves unanswered questions. I don't think it was actually anything to do with the Templars, actually, but there again, that's all we know.
One of the chronicles that you alluded to, is this the Amadi Chronicle?
This is the Amadi, yes.
What do we know about the Amadi Chronicle exactly, and why is this such an important resource?
Well, what we have is a 16th century Italian translation. It's a compilation. Most of the sources that are in this compilation, we actually have the original version. They would have been written in most cases in Old French, except for one that was written in Cypriot Greek. But most of them are in Old French. And obviously the bits that are in Old French are not so interesting because we've got the French version. But it's this period, the beginning of the 14th century, it's a very detailed narrative that we don't have the original version. Now, there are places in the description of these years where you can actually see the French sort of poking through the Italian translation. It's fairly obvious that this is a translation from the French. Very detailed. It must have been written up within a very few years of the events we're talking about. In other words, it's probably mostly written up within 10 years of the arrest of the Templars. And of course, we have that sort of nagging problem did the translator simply translate what was there, or did the translator mess it around? That's unanswerable.
Now, there's another source. I think Heracles or
No,
Heracles.
that is otherwise known as the continuations of Old French continuations of William of Tyre.
Mm-hmm.
The French William of Tyre begins with a reference to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. And when you translate Heraclius into Old French, it comes out as Heracles.
Mm-hmm.
So it's called the History of Heracles. Simply, of course, his name appears on the very first line of the text. William of Tyre wrote in Latin, and William of Tyre stopped writing in 1184. So he's irrelevant from the point of view of Cyprus. After William gave up, round about sometime in the mid-1220s, somebody translated William's Latin into French.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was that various people decided that William's text needed to be brought up to date by adding a material covering the period between 1184 and the present day. And so we're actually looking at that material. So in other words, it's hardly contemporary with 1192, but it does actually give you a sort of insight into how a later generation saw the event.
Yeah. So what happened to the Templars? Were they simply, held under arrest indefinitely, or were they expelled from Cyprus?
Some of them were held closely confined in the castle of Kyrenia, including the most senior member of the order, who was the marshal of the order, Nicolae d'Arcelier, and died in captivity. Other members of the order turn up free. There's a small group who were of Spanish origin, who come from Spanish, and they turn up back in Spain, where they've been allowed to join another military order. There's one man from Burgundy, from the east of France, called William of Vaudreuil, who long after the suppression of the order in 1333, is a local brigand, and his activities are drawn to the attention of the papacy, who actually say, yes, there's this brigand who's a former member of the Templars, and they give the name. It's quite obviously it's the same man that turned up in the Templar trial in Cyprus. So some, at least, of them sort of survived and went on to other activities. As I say, the marshal, the man who was the most senior person in the order in Cyprus at the time of the arrest, died in captivity.
Their wealth, it's confiscated, and maybe you can humor me a little bit here. Some sources say that there's hidden treasure across Cyprus. Is there any validity to this claim?
Well, let's start with the easy bit. Most of the land is given to the other order, the Hospitallers. Most of it. The only bit that we know was detached was one estate that was actually given to the titular Patriarch of Jerusalem. So what it meant was that after the suppression of the order, which is 1312, after the suppression of the order, the Hospitallers have got most of their lands, and the Hospitallers from then on until the very end of the Western rule in Cyprus are the wealthiest group on the island, apart from the crown. So that really makes the Hospitallers, the importance of them with their fortress at Colossae near Limassol. So that's that side of it. Much more interestingly is what happens to their movable property, the actual cash and valuables and other things. We know that the arms and armour were added to the royal armoury. That part is okay. That can be inventoried. What we've now got, and this is hot off the press, this is the latest information that I've got, and I mean, it's come through in the last few days, that somebody has found a document which actually tells us what we guessed, namely that quite a lot of the property that belonged to the Templars had sort of somehow got pilfered by the royal officials who were supposedly collecting it and inventorying it. We could have guessed that that was going to happen, but no, we've actually got contemporary evidence to say, yes, that's really what was going on. Part of the trouble, you see, was that the property is collected, and then basically the government take it over. Amori of Tyre is assassinated. There's quite a kerfuffle before Henry II comes back. And it's only after Henry II is back that the church authorities come back and say, look, this Templar property really should be in our keeping and not the crown keeping. And when they actually came to ask for it, the crown said, well, it's rather embarrassing that we can't actually find where it's gone. So we have this rather, I mean, as a story of what happened to the stuff, it's terribly predictable. Now, of course, the other thing is this: the Templars famously, of course, were reputed to be very, very wealthy, and indeed they were. And so what people would have expected would have been a lot of wealth in ready cash. And it's quite clear that in Cyprus, as indeed in most of Europe, they didn't find it. Now, what's happened to it? One possibility is, of course, again, that it simply got pilfered by the officials who were responsible for collecting the stuff. Another possibility, of course, in Cyprus is that the Cypriot Templars must have heard rumour of what was going on in France before they were arrested and managed to squirrel it away somewhere. So whether they actually dug a hole in the ground and buried it, or whether they had other uses for it, we don't know. My own guess is that the actual amount of money that was be kept in cash was nothing like as great as popular imagination would have it. But the idea that there is Templar treasure somewhere out there still to be discovered is a potent part of the pop culture.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Now, you've really piqued my interest here. This source that has been discovered, do we know anything about it? I know it's going to be...
It's been hiding in plain sight. It's in the Vatican archive. I think the trouble has been is that the document is, the actual parchment it's written on is suffered rather badly from damp and mould, and nobody's thought to shine an ultraviolet light on it. It's simply to the naked eye, it's largely illegible.
Peter, thank you.
Well, it's been very, very great fun for me too.
Really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Not at all, no. Well, keep it. I'll watch your progress with interest.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care. I hope you have a great evening.
Okay. Right. Yes. And same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.